Welcome. I'm Len Maddie. I have the opportunity to host today's events and to introduce our speakers this morning. And first, I'd like to introduce Dr. C. Robert Bennett, President of North Idaho College.
Well, I too want to welcome all of you here this morning, and I was frankly hoping for a little larger crowd, and perhaps as the time goes on, there'll be people drifting in from classes. I'm very excited about this program. As you know, it's part of the Popcorn Forum, and I understand in talking to Tony Stewart that this is the 20th year that the Popcorn Forum has existed, and I want to compliment him and the people responsible for establishing this program and doing the very many fine things that they've done over the past several years. The program today, the total program for the workshop, call it what you will, I guess, a series of programs, is titled Conflict, Hostility, or Harmony. Ah, here we go. I knew there'd be some more people coming in. I can't think of a more appropriate title for all of us to deal with. I can't, there's not a day goes by that we don't have some of that in our lives. And certainly the person today that's speaking, and he will be introduced by Len later, is certainly an authority on that, and I believe will enlighten us considerably. I would also like to call your attention to the fact that following this presentation at 1 o'clock, is that correct? 1:30 in the Bonner Room, there's going to be a reaction to Dr. Markman's comments. And I would like to call your attention to the people that will be involved in that. I think this will be equally interesting. Tom Mitchell, leading defense attorney, Craig Mosman, an Idaho prosecutor, Carol Peterson, director of the Kootenai County Juvenile Diversion Program, Joanne Smith, social activist for combating domestic violence, Nancy White, trainer for law enforcement agencies, and Norm Gitzel, who is a local attorney and also president of the Kootenai County Task Force. So we're going to have an interesting group of people to react, and it should be provide for some very interesting discussion. So I want to thank again Tony and the people who sponsor the Popcorn Forum for bringing this to us, and also to thank you for coming and to welcome all of you here.
As Dr. Bennett said, today is the first in our week-long symposium on conflict resolution. And for those of you who haven't had a chance yet to pick up a program of the week's events, be sure that you do, because there's much good information here and it lists all the times as well. As the overview says in the program, conflict affects us personally and collectively. Mechanisms and processes to resolve conflict determine whether we have harmony or hostility, individually, within our families, and within the community. As Idaho celebrates its centennial, the North Idaho College Popcorn Forum provides students and community members an opportunity to examine conflict resolution in those parts of life affecting us most closely: family, education, church, and the courts. The subject matter of the symposium, the week-long symposium, was prompted in part by our unique historical perspective, our unique historical position. Not only do we celebrate the centennial, but we look toward a 21st century. It's an historical position which insists that as a community we look to the future. If we reflect on the past, if we assess our present, Our vision for the future must include and value the ways of peaceful settlement. And nowhere is the need for peaceful settlement more glaringly apparent than in our topic presentation today: crime in society, violence, or order. Our speaker, Dr. Ronald Markman, is Southern California's leading forensic psychiatrist and a national expert on crime. He's also a lawyer, a medical doctor, a board-certified psychiatrist, and a neurologist. Dr. Markman has served as Associate Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Southern California, as Assistant Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at UCLA. He has been an attending staff member at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. During the last 2 decades, Dr. Markman has spent countless hours within the legal system and has seen and felt and been part of its particular madness. He offers his unique perspective on the entire process in his book, Alone with the Devil, Famous Cases of a Courtroom Psychiatrist, and I understand that copies of this will be available perhaps this afternoon or during the rest of the week. In his book, Dr. Markman exposes the inner workings of the minds of murderers, and he takes us into a world that he's witnessed firsthand. He also reveals a flawed system that ignores the victims of murder, and he criticizes a society that leans toward the idea that you must be mentally ill to commit a crime. Today, Dr. Markman will speak on homicide, a unique crime. Dr. Markman?
Thank you very much for those kind words. I do have some spare time among things that I do. And coming up here is one of them to some degree. I spent yesterday here, and it's a lovely area. I come up to Idaho periodically to go to Sun Valley, but I've never been this far north, and you have nothing to be ashamed of up here. It's beautiful. Unfortunately, the topic I'm going to talk about is not as beautiful as the weather or the area, and it's something I've been involved with for the past 25 years. And I'd like to start by sharing with you a story. It's kind of a joke, and in this Easter season, it's a heaven joke. And it has to do with an attorney who had a so-so life on earth, and St. Peter, when he died, he got up to heaven, and St. Peter wasn't quite sure whether he should go to hell or heaven. And he was pondering the entire situation, and the attorney, and to be complete, wanted to look at the different areas to see which he would prefer. And so he was taken to heaven, and there were tables and tables of food, appetizers, main courses, desserts, drinks. Everybody was just having a continuous good time. And he felt that there was no place that could improve on this situation. But in order to be complete, he asked St. Peter if he could go visit hell to see what that looked like. And he got down there, and there were these same tables of food with appetizers and hors d'oeuvres and main courses and desserts and drinks. And there were people at the table, and it seemed like an identical place. And he looked at St. Peter and he said, I don't understand the difference. The sinners are down here, the people who lived well and according to God's word are up there. What's the distinction? St. Peter said, well, if you look closely, you'll see that the people down here have had their elbows broken. So they're unable to bend their elbows to lift the food in order to enjoy it, and this is their punishment. And the attorney, being a very intelligent man, said, well, I have a solution for that, as all attorneys have solutions for everything. And he says, all you have to do is sit across from the individual at the table, and you pick up the food and feed him with a straight outstretched arm, and while you do that, he picks up the food and feeds you with a straight outstretched arm, and the inability to bend your elbow is meaningless. And with that, somebody sitting at the table turned around and said, if you think I'm going to feed the son of a gun across from me, you're crazy. Now that's an example of the problem we have with human behavior. 23 years ago, I did a study in Israel on juvenile delinquency. I thought, for the most part, that I would go there and find very little delinquency, but I was wrong. The results were relatively revealing, and I divided the population that I examined into 4 distinct groups. There were the European American immigrants, there were the African immigrants, there were the Asian immigrants, and there were the Israeli-born youngsters. And there was a significant divergence in statistics with respect to those groups. The African group was 5 times greater in delinquency incidence than the European American group, and 2.5 times greater than the Israeli-born group. But all groups were low, basically speaking, during wars. There was a 48 war, there was a 56 war, there was a 67 war. Delinquency wasn't the problem during those periods of turmoil. But coincident with those periods of turmoil, there were also immigrations into Israel, massive immigrations after the 48 war, immigrations from North Africa and Asia after the 56 war, also from North Africa, and after the 67 war, again from Asia and North Africa and Europe. And now there is another mass immigration of Russian Jews going to Israel, and I hope to update that research project in the near future. But the one thing that was interesting is that there were significant spikes in delinquency 4 to 5 years after the immigration periods. So in 1948 we had no problems, but in 1953 there was a significant delinquency spike. In 56 there was no problem, but in 1960-61 there was a significant delinquency spike. In 67 there was no problem, and in 1971 there was a significant spike. And I tried to understand that, the onset of those spikes, or the reasons for those spikes. Over that period of time, over that 25 years, there was a 300% increase in the juvenile population of Israel, with a 900% increase in delinquency. So there was a 3-to-1 ratio in that regard. So I examined, what I did to try to understand what variable was important, was I looked at migrations in this country. The Puerto Rican to New York, the black from the rural south to the urban north, the Chicano from Mexico into the Southern California or southwestern United States area. And there, the behavior patterns were quite different. What I saw in all those areas was delinquency onset almost within a year, actually immediately after the migration occurred. Now I know that human beings don't differ that much regardless of where they live in the world. And I tried to make sense of those 2 divergent observations, and finally it came to me. The difference being that in Israel, the migrations occurred with intact families. The migrations of the Puerto Rican, the black, and the Chicano here in the United States occurred with either broken or one-parent families. And there I saw a significant distinction in the 2 groups. And what explained the onset of delinquency in Israel 4 to 5 years later was that in most instances, we had an Eastern cultured family coming to a Westernized society, or Occidentalized society. And these individuals were able to keep their family intact and together for 3 to 4 years until the children who were exposed to this new environment in the school came home and began making demands and demanding changes in the behavior pattern of what was to them a paternalistic society, in whether it was Yemen or Libya or Egypt or Iraq, etc. When this occurred and the father was incapable of controlling the family anymore, and the family semi-disintegrated, the women would go out to work, and most of them would work as housekeepers. They would see how families that they worked for lived, and they would come home and also make demands. And ultimately, the father lost his status as head of the household. This ultimately led to family breakdown and loss of family support system. And this correlated very closely and very definitively to the onset of delinquency in Israel. Now, if you transpose that phenomenon to the American process, There's no problem with understanding it because there is no intact family to come within these migrations. And the youngsters that move to New York or move to Chicago or move to Detroit or move to Los Angeles or move to Phoenix came with very, very limited support systems, with one-parent families who could really not control them very well. And regardless of the fact that an individual may be well-meaning, it is impossible for one individual to act both as mother and father and to provide the nurturing, the support, the discipline, the direction, and the modeling for their youngsters. In one child families, let alone multi-children families, which most of these migrations involve. Now, I bring this up because in assessing the future of this country, I think we have a difficult problem in family structure and family integrity. In today's world, in 1990, 65% of youngsters in America are being raised in one-parent families. This is creating a very difficult psychological developmental phenomenon. In the critical ages of from 2 to 7, broadly speaking, a certain aspect of the human psyche evolves and develops, and it requires identification with parental models. And that's what psychiatrists call the superego. You might call it an internal conscience or an internal policeman. If it doesn't develop between those years, it isn't going to develop at all. Now, not every one-parent family produces children with deficient or absent superegos. Only a small percentage do. And in our general population, I would say that the incidence or the prevalence of psychopathy, which is the ultimate result of this absent superego, is about 2%. But as we increase the number of one-parent families in our society, and if we just double that number to 4%, we are ultimately going to double, if not increase more greatly, the number of criminals in our society and the number of problem individuals in our society. Now, luckily, not every sociopath, and the terms, by the way, are sociopath, psychopath, and antisocial personality. They are all interchangeable and equal or equivalent to each other. So if I use them interchangeably, don't get confused with them. But the absence of a superego produces a sociopath. Not every sociopath becomes a criminal, luckily. If we had that problem, we'd have more than 5 million people in custody in the United States today. Some of them become politicians and used car dealers and other things. But the problem with the sociopath is that he is the primary committer of crimes. He lacks a conscience, and he lacks a concern for other individuals in society. In December of this year, I was the victim of one of these psychopaths. I was walking down a busy Los Angeles street a week before Christmas, about to get into my car, and 2 youngsters drove up who I thought were asking directions, but instead they were giving directions because they had a gun. And they pointed it at me, and that barrel of that gun looked awfully big. And they asked me for a purse that I was carrying, which I gave them very dutifully. And then they asked me to come closer to the car, and rather than do that, I ran. One of them chased out after me, and there were a couple of people in the area, but they didn't notice what was happening, and he happened to catch me. He didn't have the gun, the other person did, and he hit me, and I hit him back, and that surprised him, and he ran away. I think he was looking for this bracelet, which I still have on, but this was an individual who was committing what most people would describe as a, quote, senseless crime, unquote. But it's not a senseless crime from his perspective, if you understand where he's coming from. What he's doing, he's interested in fulfilling and helping his own self-well-being. He's interested in getting what he wants when he wants it. He's not interested in postponing gratification. He's interested in instant gratification. So what happens under those circumstances, if he sees something he wants, he'll take it. And he'll kill for it if he has to. Now, I don't know whether that gun was loaded, and I'm not really sure that I acted properly by running, except to say that the end result of my being here suggests that I must have done the right thing. But you can't tell people what to do under any circumstance because there's no rhyme or reason to that kind of behavior. But I would caution that it not be called senseless, because it's goal-directed and it's very, very definitive from the perspective of the predator, meaning the individual who assaults you. And these predators exist in our society in numbers that are too difficult to handle. Let's assume that we have a society of 10 people, and let's assume that 10% of those people are psychopaths. That's one person. Now, it's not difficult to realize under a society of 10 people that the other 9 can control the 1. Wouldn't be difficult in that small an environment. But now let's expand it to 250 million in the United States. And let's say the 10% figure applies. Now we have 25 million psychopaths walking the streets, of which maybe 15 to 20% of them are criminal. 250 million are incapable of controlling 25 million, or even the 5 million, or the 20% that might act in criminal activities. And therefore, we are having a burgeoning criminal activity in this country, not just because we have more sociopaths developing, and I would venture to say that with the new generation that will increase based on the information that I gave you earlier, but also because we don't know how to deal with them, and we're dealing with them from the wrong perspective. You can't put an individual with psychopathic features in custody and rehabilitate him. That's an impossible task. It's like putting a square peg in a round hole. You don't teach him what's right, and you don't teach him what's wrong, because he doesn't have that internalized concept within him. What's right is what makes him feel good, and what's wrong is what makes him feel bad. So you can't say to him, don't steal because it's not right, or don't steal because it's wrong, or don't steal because there's a commandment against it, or don't steal because Daddy won't like you if you don't steal. What you've got to tell him is, don't steal because if you do so, the risk and the punishment is too great for you to sustain if you get caught. Now, the difficulty with that argument in our society, the latter argument of a realistic approach, telling him not to steal because the risk is too great for him, is that realistically the risk is not too great. For every 100 crimes in this country that are considered felonies, only 2 people go to jail. If you talk in terms of the death penalty, and I don't want to get into the political issue of whether the death penalty is cruel and unusual, or whether it's human, or whether it's ethical, that's not the purpose of what I have to say about it right now, or whether it's a deterrent. But what I have to say is that the death penalty is a meaningless argument in the criminal arena, simply because, and the figures of Amnesty International will show you, that since 1977 through 86, a period of 10 years, there were 200,000 homicides in this country. There were 68 executions. Now, if you take that figure alone in terms of people who get punished, and I'm not talking about the people that spend time in custody, and certainly many do, but people who get punished with the ultimate punishment, namely a death sentence, the percentages are minuscule and even insignificant. And the same is true for robbery and burglary. I've examined individuals who have rap sheets that are 10 and 15 pages long. There are 7 crimes to a rap sheet, to 1 page on a rap sheet. This is a 30-year-old man who has committed 30 to 40 major felonies and is in custody, is no longer in custody. I was on the Oprah Winfrey show recently. I sat next to a bank robber. He was 35 years old. He was a 3-time loser, but was out of custody. The first time he was picked up, he spent 5 years in custody. The next time he was picked up, he spent 7 years in custody. And this third time, he was convicted of 3 bank robberies, even though it was alleged that he had committed 15. He was given 146 years. His attorney was a one with a lot of initiative, and he found a judge that bought an argument that he gave. And after 6 years, the man was released on parole and was sitting next to me on the Oprah Winfrey show. Now, this man was a very congenial, very friendly man. I spoke with him, and he was asked from the audience, number one, whether he would commit another bank robbery. And he said, no, I don't think so. He said, but that's what I said after the first bank robbery, and I got caught. And then they asked him from the audience, what would it have taken to have promoted a different pathway of life for him? And he said, interestingly enough, that if someone would have taken me out to the woodshed the first time when I was 10 years old, when I was caught stealing my first hubcaps, I probably wouldn't have started on this bank robbery bin in the first place. But number one, it's enjoyable. I've been convicted of 5 of them in my 20 years of adulthood. I've committed about 75 of them. And even there is a percentage that suggests that psychopaths don't get the message that they're going to get punished if they do get caught. And most of them do not get caught in our society. Now that's the problem that we have for the future. And it's a different problem than we've had in the past with regards to criminal behavior, and particularly murder. And I want to address that issue right now. We as a society, and we're not the only society, every society does, but we as a society have a morbid fascination for murder. It permeates our literature. Our fiction is loaded with crimes of homicide and killing. Stephen King, Peter Falk as Columbo on television. Most of the big shows on television are criminal shows involving people who commit crimes, most often murder. And I found that when I spoke of cases that I'd been involved in, when I was able to, and there was no confidentiality associated with it, that people were glued to every word I said, and they couldn't get enough of that information. Very much like, and I don't know if you have this problem here in Idaho on the freeways, but in Los Angeles, even though we're gridlocked, we get more gridlocked when there's an accident, and the traffic is bumper to bumper going both ways. We call them rubbernecks. The people on the other side who should be going through are waiting to see the body across the way in the accident. So we're fascinated with bodily injury, and maybe what it does is it allows us to deal with our own feelings of omnipotence in as much as we survive while that other person doesn't. But we also have ascribed various kinds of names to killing. It's the only crime in the world, and certainly in the United States, that has a multitude of identifications. There's infanticide involving infants, there's suicide involving yourself, there's fratricide, there's matricide, there's patricide, there's filiacide, and no other crime is divided into so many sides. There's serial killers, there are mass murderers, and even within the crime of homicide, which is the general term in California, and I'm sure here in Idaho, there are major levels of criminal responsibility. There is first-degree murder in California. There's second-degree murder. Many places call it third-degree murder. We call it voluntary manslaughter. There's involuntary manslaughter, and there's vehicular manslaughter. And there are 2 legally acceptable killing procedures called justifiable and excusable. So there are 7 legal identifications for the taking of a human life within the California Penal Code. Each of them require a greater degree as you go up the scale of evil, emotional and mental evil associated with the act. So that with first-degree murder in California, you're required to 1, premeditate, 2, deliberate, and 3, harbor malice aforethought, which is a legal word of art and has nothing to do with the word malice in the English dictionary. But in general, it can be identified as a man-endangering state of mind. Now, with a first-degree murder, you require all those states of mind. With second-degree murder, you don't have to have premeditated or thought beforehand, and you don't have to have deliberated or weighed the consequences. All you had to do was act with a man-endangering state of mind. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the law, criminal activity requires the union of 2 situations concurrently. You have to have the act, but you also have to have a state of mind. And that's why psychiatrists have been thrown into the equation in assessing people who commit crimes. The act alone without a state of mind is not a crime. A state of mind alone without an act is not a crime. We further identify the union of 2 individuals who conspire to commit a crime as the act itself, because we have realized in our society that human beings will do things together that they won't do separately. And in the book that I wrote, for instance, I can tell you, having examined 3 members of the Manson family, that none of them could have committed the crimes that they were responsible for on their own. There are also a couple of people that I examined known as the Hillside Strangler, Ken Bianchi and his cousin Anthony Bono. Neither of them had any history of behaving in the way in which they acted together. It is almost, and for those of you who are philosophy majors, you may understand that it is somewhat Hegelian, named after the philosopher Hegel, who suggested that when 2 individuals or 2 forces meet and have conflict, that they produce a new force or what he called a thesis and an antithesis produces a new thesis. And that new, in terms of 2 individuals coming together, they produce a new ego, and that new ego is capable of performing acts that neither of the 2 could individually or separately. Now, in this country, we have about 20,000 homicides a year. 10,000 of those are murders. We are identified as a very violent society. Many people like to point at the fact that we have more guns than we should have, and there's the gun control problem that has been politicized. Other people seem to think that we are too wishy-washy and we coddle criminals, and there's a political confrontation in that area with severity of sentencing. The death penalty has led to political confrontation. And I would submit to you that what has happened really is, with all these political confrontations, we have created a lack of awareness that the major problem is not gun control. Because if you look at Israel, which I talked about earlier, and Switzerland, every family has a gun in these countries, and they don't come close to the incidents of homicide that we do. Sweden would be looked upon as a very non-violent country based on its background. But if you take the homicide rate and add it to the suicide rate, which is very high in Sweden, the incidence of violence, if you add the 2 together, is higher in Sweden than it is in the United States. So the matter that we are more violent, I think, is a red herring. I think there is more violence in this country, not because we are more violent, but because we are very free. We have more freedoms in this country, and I'm not suggesting that we give them up, but the price that we pay for a lot of the freedoms that we have is the ability of people who are prone to violence to act out in that violence. And I'm talking about the psychopath and the sociopath. Now, in the past, people who acted out criminally were different if they committed homicides than if they committed other crimes. I could walk into a jail anywhere in this country and, after a little while of being there, point to which are the people there that have killed other people and which are the people there that have committed other crimes. Generally speaking, with the rapist, the robber, the burglar, the assaulter, the car thief, the arsonist, if you washed them and shaved them and cleaned them and dressed them and polished their shoes and dropped them at the Academy Awards presentations in Hollywood, they'd look out of place, they'd act out of place, and they'd be identified as being out of place. They would not belong under those circumstances. If you took collectively the people who commit homicides who are in custody, and you did the same thing and dropped them at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion for the Academy Awards, they'd fit right in. Why? Because people who kill are like you and me. Because we're all capable of doing it. And we're all capable of doing it simply because that is part and parcel of our personality structure and our heritage, so to speak, as human beings. I had a professor once who mentioned the fact that he thought that man was the missing link between the ape and the human being, and maybe that would explain why we're capable of such destructive behavior. Now, a further thing I would like to emphasize is that people who kill, if they're like you and me, they really represent a cross-section of society. That came home to roost very clearly in my life. On one occasion, very recently, I bought a house in a fashionable area of Los Angeles. And within 3 or 4 months after I bought it, police and detectives were coming around asking my young kids about their dad and investigating me, and I didn't know why. And finally, about 8 months later, I got a call from a friend of mine in the district attorney's office saying that he knew that I had bought a house on such and such a street in such and such an area. And I said, I know that. Why are you calling me to tell me that? And he said that, well, you may have noticed that we were investigating you and it was a mistake. We were really looking for the previous owner and we hadn't realized that he'd sold the house. Now, some background on that is that I bought that house and the owner had a fifth mortgage on that house at 21%. That's very high for those students who know nothing about buying houses. Fifth mortgages are very rare on top of that. This man had never been in trouble before. Very similar to people who kill. They've never been in trouble before. And interestingly enough, whereas the recidivistic rate for all crimes in this country is 62% within 3 years, the recidivistic rate for people who kill, and mind you, 95% of people who kill are ultimately released back into the community. The recidivistic rate is only 15%, so there's also a difference there. But this man who I bought the house from had contracted to kill his partner of 25 years. He had never before even gotten a traffic ticket. And here he was in his late 50s, involved in what we would consider the most heinous crime known to man. And by the way, the first crime listed in the Bible, Cain and Abel. And I'll get to that in a minute. And I was trying to figure out why would he contract to kill his partner? And I investigated into it. There were no arguments. They had been friendly for 25 years. They'd been socially friendly. He needed money. The business was going down the tubes. This was a successful business of 25 years. His wife worked in the school system. His daughter went to the school system. They were well known in the community, and all of a sudden he was in hiding from the police. He ultimately got caught and was tried and sentenced on a first-degree murder conviction, with the person he contracted for the murder testifying against him on a leniency plea. So the person who did the killing got convicted of second-degree murder. He who solicited the killing got convicted of first-degree murder. But why was he willing to do that, take another human life? He wasn't a sociopath. He wasn't interested in his own aggrandizement or his own well-being. He needed money, and he was looking at an insurance policy. But that wasn't the real basis for it. I would submit to you that he demonstrated what is the major basis for why people have killed in the past. And this cuts across all kinds of killings, regardless of the psychiatric diagnosis. And that's the emotion of humiliation. This is a man who was being humiliated by the failure of his long-time successful business. And if you look at the story of Cain and Abel, and whether you call it allegorical or whether you call it historical, Cain killed his brother because Cain was humiliated by God's rejection of his sacrifice. I might even take that one step further. If I asked you what the immediate cause of World War II was, I think most of you would agree that it was the invasion of Poland by the Germans. That on September 1st, 1939. But what was the underlying cause of World War II? And if you look back, it was the humiliation of Germany because of the Treaty of Versailles. And they couldn't deal with that humiliation except by becoming aggressive. And ultimately that led to 30 million killings or more in World War II. Now, if that doesn't give you an example of where humiliation lies in the equation of why people kill, I can refer you to the book I wrote, and of the 18 stories in that book, all 18 of them demonstrate an element of humiliation. Whether it's Charles Manson and his family, who were humiliated by their rejection within society, they were an entity unto themselves, or whether it was Fumiko Kimura, who walked into the Pacific Ocean with her 2 children, infant children, and drowned them because she was humiliated by her husband's affair with another woman, who made matters worse by calling her up and telling her what the gory details were. Or whether it was Priscilla Ford, who drove down Virginia Avenue in Reno on Thanksgiving Day in 1981 and ran down 36 people, killing 6 of them, because she was humiliated by the fact that the Department of Social Service in Nevada had taken her only daughter away from her and were not allowing her to visit and to see the daughter. And on Thanksgiving Day in 81, she was sitting in McDonald's with a hamburger, a French fry, and some Coke, and what else but the ultimate humiliation of having to eat Thanksgiving dinner alone with a very fat 22% hamburger content in the meat. So humiliation is a major force in why people kill. It is not the only force, but if you understand that, then you don't come up with the answer that people kill because they're angry. They don't. They may be ancillarily angry, but that's not the major cause for why they kill. They're humiliated. They don't kill because they're crazy or psychotic. Crazy people, the majority of crazy people are not dangerous, and the majority of people who kill are not crazy. Unfortunately, we as a society look upon that kind of behavior and say, we wouldn't do it, therefore the person who did it must be mentally disturbed. And that understanding begets the fact, or denies the fact, that people behave in a very goal-directed, self-serving, and sometimes equilibrium-related manner in order that they survive. People kill because the humiliation is so great that the killing allows them to reorder or restructure their own internal self-being. When Fumiko walked into the ocean, she loved her children. She didn't want to kill them. And yet, there was a certain tranquility associated with what she did that allowed her to act the way she did. Now, she did so within the framework of a very severe depression. There's no question about that. But there was a humiliation associated with it that was overwhelming. Now, luckily, we all get humiliated, and luckily, the majority of us don't step across the line and kill. Why some people do and some people don't, we don't know. But generally speaking, I would say that although people who kill cut across all psychiatric diagnostic categories, that as we move into the future, we will see more and more of killers fall into the category of psychopathic and paranoid personalities. And there are two additional variables that I'm afraid are going to increase the number of killings and, yes, the number of crimes in our society, and they've already done so to some degree. One of them is drugs. 80% of all criminal activity is drug or alcohol related to some degree. And as more and more people involve themselves in more and more mind-controlling chemicals, we are going to have more and more unacceptable aggressive behavior evident in our society. And the second element that I think is important is that we as a country have abandoned a consensus national ethic. There is no national ethic in our country anymore. And this is not to say that there is one specific ethic that is appropriate, but there are 250 million different ethics in our society right now, where people are willing to do and say and act in a way that is comfortable for them, notwithstanding the rules of the past and the heritage and the historical perspective from which we come. I think it's important to understand that. And until we look upon the primary problems associated with criminal activity, until we understand the fact that we have to deal with psychopaths in a very, very different way than we would deal with other individuals, until we understand that family support and family integrity is a very important element of psychological upbringing in society, not in this society, but everywhere. And I might add, for instance, that while I was in Israel in the 60s, I examined the kibbutz, the collective farm. And in those instances, the children were not raised within a unit family structure. They were raised in kind of a kindergarten. They slept together. There were mother surrogates who handled the entire brood of kids for the entire day while the parents went out to work. These kids grew up with very significant psychological problems. There was an increase of schizoid or withdrawal behavioral patterns in these individuals. They could not get along in society very well. They became very good soldiers because they were able to take direction and orders very readily without questioning. They were excellent soldiers, and there was a high increase of sexual orientation difficulties and sexual misconduct difficulties in those children that grew up. And so that demonstrates that an intact family, even though you have caring individuals, is more important and cannot be substituted for by nursery schools, by Head Start programs. What you need are parents. And until we reverse the numbers that I'm getting from all areas, namely that kids spend 6 hours a day watching television and 6 minutes a day talking to their parents, I think we're in for a big problem. Now, generally speaking, that might look pessimistic, but I'm not basically a pessimist. What I hope to impart is that I am realistic and I can identify where the problem lies, and we have to attack the problem from that point on and go forward. And that's where improvement in the 21st century lies. Thank you very much. stop now because I was told to leave it open for some questions. And if anybody has something they'd like to bring up or like me to clarify, I'd be glad to do so. Yes, ma'am?
Do they have gun control in Sweden?
They don't have guns.
Oh, in Sweden they don't.
In Sweden, individuals are not allowed to carry guns. But the suicide rate is the highest in the world. And as I say, if you add the suicide and the homicide rate, then it is a greater incident rate than it is in this country. Yes?
What is recidivistic?
Recidivistic, repeat. Just the 62% recidivistic rate means that within 3 years after they get released from custody, 62% of prisoners nationwide reoffend, get caught reoffending. That doesn't mean that more of them don't reoffend, but 62% get caught reoffending. Whereas with homicide rates, that's only 15% of the people that are released. Yes, sir?
You offered the suggestion that humiliation was the cause of World War II. Are you offering that as the cause of other wars as well?
I hadn't thought of it. I used that as an example, but I certainly think that there was a certain element that you could look upon as humiliation in World War I. And most of the time when we talk of wars, we talk in terms of economics. But I would submit that economics are very closely related to one's own identity and one's own integrity. And whether you talk about the 100 Years' War, the War of Roses, the Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War, now that you mention it, King George humiliated us. I mean, he completely subordinated the colonists, thought nothing of them, and treated them not as second-class citizens, but as citizenless within the British Empire. And if you look at the Civil War, if you apply that concept, the South felt humiliated by the fact that the North was trying to impose a way of life on them that they didn't want, and they wanted to keep their own way of life. So I think humiliation would play a factor in most of the war, in all the wars that we were involved in, certainly. Yes, ma'am?
Of the 10,000 murders each year in the U.S., who murders whom? By gender, by age, by economic class, by education class?
Well, as I mentioned before, it cuts across all social lines. Most recently, the ones that have hit the papers are, they've hit up here, the Menendez children who killed their parents in our area. My sons happen to know the two boys. The two boys are lovely boys. I've talked to their teachers. There was no indication. They were not aggressive. They were not hostile. They were boys next door, so to speak. And the List case in New Jersey of the man who killed his family of 5 and was convicted 18 years later. And those also demonstrate an element of humiliation, getting back to your question. And again, the Menendez is an alleged murder by the boys, but if in fact that's true, the story is that the father was writing them out of his will, which they saw as a rejection and a humiliation. The List case, if you look at the letter he wrote, had to do with the fact that he couldn't deal with the fact that he wasn't supporting the family properly, couldn't make enough money, and they were not about to go on welfare because that would be humiliating for him. And in that regard, he then took their lives. And if you look at the other case, I believe the man's name is Chavez, the man who allegedly set the fire in that Haitian dance hall in New York that killed 80 some odd people. He did so because one of the dancers there had rejected him. And I think there also is an element of humiliation. But generally speaking, number one, people who kill and murders, there's a higher incidence of women within that crime, as opposed to women who, well, rape is very unusual involving women, although it can apply. But women who are murderers, I'm talking about, there's a higher incidence of women who kill than who commit other crimes. And it cuts across all sections. We have people who kill in the upper social strata and in the lower social strata, and it need not be. For the most part, half of them involve people who know each other, and the other half don't. Now, there are other statistics, but I don't have them right off the top of my head. Yes, ma'am?
What about the wave of school killings that started with the Lord Van outside of Gwinnett, Illinois? What kind of trend do you see there? It seemed like for a while there was a whole rash of people going in and killing school kids.
Well, in Los Angeles, we have drive-by shootings, and we still have them, where kids just drive by and just gun down whoever's in the area. And I think and there's the Wilding episode in New York, where the woman was mass raped and left to die by I think 15 or 16 kids. Only 6 were charged. But I think that this is an example of what I talked about earlier, namely the increased number of psychopathic kids evolving and permeating our school system. And the people who are killing are getting younger and younger and younger. When I started in this business, you rarely saw a kid under 14 in the juvenile court system who committed a homicide. Now it is becoming very common and very prevalent. Yes, ma'am?
You have a distinction then between the psychopathic killer and the killer who is killing out of personal humiliation?
No, psychopaths are humiliated too.
But not necessarily in that episode, is that it?
They are humiliated in one way or another. They may be they don't have to take out the humiliation on the individual who humiliated them. Fumiko Kimura, who walked into the Pacific Ocean, wasn't humiliated by her children. She was humiliated by her husband. And the psychopath who may act out aggressively may have been humiliated by his girlfriend or his next door neighbor or his father or somebody else, and then acts out at some stranger in what we then identify as a senseless act.
Okay, so in that case, with the psychopath, it's different from the instant gratification of just wanting something.
No, it may be that he wants something also, but because of the anger is global and not directed anywhere, but just directed out there, he will act out in inappropriate aggression, even though he gets what he wants. My father, years ago, was the victim of a robbery in a liquor store where he was manager, and he was instructed, if they come in, give him the money. And he gave him the money immediately. They pistol whipped him, and he was found unconscious. My son's boyfriend's father wasn't that lucky. He owned a store. People came in. He gave him the money immediately, and the guy responded, "I don't want to leave any witnesses," and shot him, killed him. Now, this was, I would submit to you, psychopathic behavior, and the man didn't care. The assailant didn't care about the life of the other individual. It was a piece of Kleenex to him. Yes, sir?
Why do you live in LA with all these crimes?
After seeing a place like this, I wonder. Well, you know, it's very difficult to just get up and leave once you've established professional reputation and your kids are involved in their environment, in their schools. Right now I have my last kids finishing high school, and I have thought of leaving Los Angeles. I have. Yes, ma'am?
I have a question about what do you feel should be done with the computers? Would it go out and repeat the crimes they already committed and just release them?
Well, that's a problem, and it's a problem simply because we're not dealing with the issues at the proper level. A person who commits a second crime many times doesn't get sentenced any more severely than the first crime. And a lot of the focus is on how we're treating him during the sentencing. I have seen some, for instance, Lompoc, which is a federal prison in Southern California, where, quote, white-collar criminals go. There are tennis courts there, sunbathing facilities. Each person has his own room with television. I could use a vacation like that. And I think that You have to understand that negative reinforcement is a very, very important factor in modifying behavior. And we are not negatively reinforcing individuals within the criminal system at all. If only 2 people get incarcerated for every 100 crimes that are committed, then we're losing the battle.
But you also said that the crime committed could be rehabilitated because they have no conscience.
That's right.
So what should we do with them? Should we just let them out and commit the crimes?
I think that's a question that has to be solved by the political process. How we deal. Right now, the approach to dealing with criminals goes back to the statement that says a society can only be identified by the way it treats its worst individuals. And we are doing our best to treat our worst individuals, who I call predators, very civilly. And maybe that's the wrong way to go. Well, I thank you all for your hospitality and your attention. Thank you.
Dr. Markman will be available for more questions this afternoon at 1:30 in the Lana Room. I remind you about the response panel, and some of those people, perhaps all of them, are here right now, so you'll be able to hear from them and their responses to Dr. Markman's presentation, and he too will be available for questions. Please join us at 1:30 in the Bonner Room, and throughout the rest of the week, be sure that you pick up a program so that you know exactly when and where and who. Thank you all for coming.
Let's go.